that. Oh. Am I on? Yeah, I'm on, good. Okay. Oh, that's one of those embarrassing moments you get as a public speaker sometimes, isn't it? The interpretive dance, you saw it here. Okay, I'll start again. We've now got Dr. Angela Akol will be speaking to us. She's a representative of IPAS Alliance Africa. And she is an MD and a PhD who's a development program leader with 20 years experience directing and implementing health and development programs at national and community levels in developing countries. Her cross-cutting skills in research, program leadership and management are expertly applied in her role as director of IPAS's Africa Alliance Office, based in Nairobi, Kenya, covering sexual and reproductive rights programs across East Africa and leading policy advocacy across the continent. She holds a medical degree and a PhD in global health from the University of Bergen. So will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Akol to our conference. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this subject of immense contemporary interest: rewilding reproductive rights. Rewilding as a term speaks to an ending with a backstory. It invites the question, how did we get here to a situation that we need to change? In discussing rewilding reproduction, it is necessary to delve into a discussion of reproductive praxis over time. I will attempt to do three things. First, to arrive at an understanding of rewilding as a decolonization initiative. Secondly, I will examine how sexual and reproductive health on the African continent was disrupted by colonialism, and finally, suggest pathways to reproductive justice. I seek your indulgence in restricting myself to the African continent, but of course this does not diminish the fact that colonialism had impacts on other parts of the globe. Let us start with conceptualizing a new reproductive world. Rewilding is a term from the global south. It is a term that directly challenges the colonizers' model of the world, a model which sustains a hierarchical and asymmetrical configuration with Europe and North America at the apex of power. Consequently, I would like us to think of rewilding in 4 dimensions. The first basic dimension would be to think of rewilding as decolonization and indigenization of our reproductive rights. A second dimension to consider would be one of rewilding as an ongoing process, an emancipatory gesture to contest coloniality and reverse its subordinating effects. Thirdly, we might think of rewilding as a concept that strikes down the very notion that the right to define our own realities is anyone but ours. And the fourth dimension that we can think of rewilding as is imagining into action a world fit for our descendants. The domain of sexual and reproductive health is critically important for a discussion of decolonization, precisely because it is palpably colonial. Present-day sexual and reproductive health beliefs and attitudes are a Eurocentric order that drew inspiration from Christian patriarchy and imperialism on this continent especially. What do we mean? Sexuality itself was used as an instrument of colonialism. Obviously, this is a very wide subject that we can't enter into in totality. But in its simplest terms, the colonial masters imposed their sexual norms as the correct expression of sexuality. Any deviation from this norm was dismissed as morally backward. The sexual norms of cultures that the colonialists found, principally polygamy, homosexuality, and gender fluidity when they occurred, helped the European master to construct themselves to identify themselves as sexually restrained and therefore morally superior. Sexuality was an important tool because it acted as a power structure to justify white settlement. Consequently, we came to believe in a European brand of sexuality and moral restraint, which is restricted to a heterosexual marital unit. Imposing European sexual norms was an important part of imposing colonial social order, and therefore correcting the vices, the sexual vice that was encountered on the African continent was a preoccupation necessary for the imposition of colonial power. The obvious irony, of course, was the growing population of half-caste children, which was embarrassing and which was identified as a threat to colonial dominance because it signaled a moral fallibility of the superior colonial being. Conversely, some forms of sexual and reproductive health were left unregulated because controlling them was inconvenient to the social order. Female circumcision is cited. Where colonial governments' hold on power was tenuous and unstable, conscious choice was made to leave female circumcision unregulated so as not to antagonize local leaders. As we progress on this discussion, I will center fertility and abortion as two manifestations of colonial endowments on present-day sexual and reproductive health. Starting with fertility, we begin with recognizing that fertility has fallen quite impressively in the recent past. But fertility rates in Africa remain relatively high at about 4.8 children per woman, relative to the rest of the world, despite significant declines in child mortality and an overall increase in female education. This picture, obviously, like all averages, masks marked differences that can be directly linked to historical institutional endowments. The causal linkage between colonial origins and fertility difference in sub-Saharan Africa is visible in the divergence of fertility rates between former British and French colonies on the continent. The chart before us shows that before the early 1970s, fertility rates in former French colonies were slightly lower than those in Anglophone Africa. However, by the end of the decade, the 1970s, the trend had reversed and a significant gap began to emerge until in about 2016, where the fertility gap between former French and English territories more than tripled. This gap is directly linked to differences in colonial population policies. I'll explain. In 1920, France was concerned that her population size was smaller than that of her European rivals, and therefore France adopted a pronatalist law which strictly prohibited any propaganda regarding contraception and which severely repressed abortion. Naturally, these laws were passed on to the colonial territories, and while they were repealed in 1967 in France, they remained in effect in Africa for much longer. It was not until the World Population Conference in Bucharest in 1974 that attitudes around family planning began to change in Francophone Africa. In contrast, on the other hand, British policies were more liberal. In the 1930s, and especially after the First World War, a colonial population policy was promulgated to stimulate economic growth in Britain and in the colonies by limiting childbirth. The second domain in which colonial influences play out is in the abortion domain. The colonial order criminalized abortion and spawned policies and laws that regulated reproductive morality in Africa. Remember, Africans were viewed as being morally, reproductively reprehensible. The criminalization of abortion is intertwined with the misidentity of women as mere reproductive beings with no voice. The laws criminalizing abortion present two very unenviable choices to women with an unwanted pregnancy. Either you reluctantly become a mother, or you resort to illegal and frequently unsafe abortion with a consequent toll on your life and health. In the abortion domain, statecraft following African independence has reproduced the same oppressions as found under the colonial order. The irony should not be lost on us that, with a few exceptions, African states have maintained the order, ostensibly on the grounds of protecting African culture and religions from Western decadence. All this is at the cost of depriving Africans access to much needed health care. There have been attempts to rewild sexual and reproductive health, and the most seminal one is the adoption of the Protocol of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, conveniently and briefly called the Maputo Protocol. This was adopted by the African Union in 2003, and it serves as a very important attempt to decolonize sexual and reproductive health and rights. In particular, Article 14 of the protocol is the very first time in history that abortion was cast as a discrete human right in a human rights treaty. This is to be applauded. And yet, this protocol, which is still the frame through which we drive for reproductive rights on the continent, is still in the thrall of patriarchy, and it is still under the dominion of Abrahamic faiths. The Maputo Protocol still requires the grounds of rape, incest, and risk to health or life as preconditions before an abortion can be sanctioned. Though it is intended to promote the sexual and reproductive health of women, Article 14 ultimately retains the crime and punishment model bequeathed to us by the colonial state. In juxtaposition, I present the South African Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1996. This act was put in place after apartheid rule to signal a new constitutional dispensation, and it provides a perfect example on reforming abortion law in ways that break decisively with coloniality. The act transforms the regulation of abortion from a crime and punishment model to a reproductive health model in two ways. First, by permitting abortion on mere request in the first trimester, and secondly, by recognizing that competent providers are central to termination of pregnancy. It has faced implementation challenges, but this notwithstanding, we must recognize that it has broken ties with South Africa's colonial past and transformed access to legal abortion for African women. Has it all been bad? Must we throw out the baby with the bathwater as we rewild reproduction? While we acknowledge that rewilding entails dismantling the multiple layers of entrenched colonial ideologies, practices, and structures that encompass our reproductive lives, we must not conflate rewilding with de-Westernization. We must recognize that we have a multiplicity of African identities, and rewilding our reproduction must propel us forward with each of these multiplicities involved in the discussion. We must also recognize that the African identity is not static. Our culture is dynamic, and it is open to influence from exogenous cultures. Given the legacy of colonialism, most sexual and reproductive health services and initiatives are driven by previously colonizing countries, which is only right and just as a form of resource distribution to previous colonies who might not have the financial muscle to address their own reproductive concerns. In seeking to rewild reproductive health, we must recognize that the well-meaning decolonization adventure has the capacity to cause harm. We must seek to maintain the value that sexual and reproductive health services that are promulgated by previous colonizers, that this value is maintained to the people that need the services. In rewilding, a driving aim should be to leave communities better equipped to function independently. In conclusion, I will offer that rewilding entails overcoming the historical status of subordination of Africans through colonialism and imperialism. And this status persists today in the realm of sexual and reproductive health. Fertility and abortion demonstrate colonial continuities in the post-colonial African state. Human rights instruments such as the Maputo Protocol play a critical role in abortion and sexual and reproductive health jurisprudence and should be used as an opportunity to reimagine a reproductive justice world in Africa. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing this subject with you in greater detail.
So thank you very much. We now have the opportunity to welcome Angela to the big screen above and for your questions and answers. So I wonder if we could have our two volunteers, please, to come down ready with the microphones. Can you please wait until they get a microphone, because Angela will not be able to hear you unless you're talking into a mic. So thank you very much for that wonderful discussion of what rewilding means. Some questions from the floor, please. We've got some responses or questions. Yes, down the front here, please. And can you also please give your name and your institution when you ask?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Alison Swites and I'm from UCT and St George's University of London. I really appreciated what you were saying about kind of access to abortion services and the ways that that's changed. And I suppose this is sort of a question and a comment that I think all of us continue to think with. Even in country contexts like South Africa, which you used as an example, I'm South African, where termination of pregnancy services are legally available, the sort of social norms and societal kind of stigmatization of trying to access termination of services, termination of pregnancy still means that it's not actually like accessible to a lot of young women. So how do we make moves towards matching what might be, legally, constitutionally more progressive policy? How do we shift the kind of social and societal norms to really make these sorts of services accessible? Thank you.
So, Dr. Angela, we'll take that question now. Yeah.
Thank you, Alison. And thank you so much to the organizers, Minor and Professor Nolwazi. I once again apologize that I'm unable to be there in person to interact with all of you. Alison, you point out a very big irony, and for those who work in abortion rights, it's a preoccupation. How do we dismantle the stigma that causes a perpetuation of unsafe abortion? And we recognize also that stigma is at multiple levels, but the most insidious form is personal stigmatization. That is the stigma that individual women feel that they cannot access an abortion procedure, even if it is legal and it's safely available. How do we navigate that? I think we just have to keep doing personal education, have conversations with women and girls, but at the broader level, the programming for safe abortion access cannot proceed without stigma reduction activities, both at the policy level, at the service delivery level, and at the individual level. IPAS, an organization that I was a part of until about a month ago, has very groundbreaking stigma reduction tools that usually precede any abortion intervention. And one of those is the values clarification exercises. So I think people must have values clarification at the institutional level and at the personal and individual level in order for them to access safe services.
Thank you. We had another question over here.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Lakshmi Lingam. I'm a professor from India. Thanks, Dr. Angela, for your presentation, because you, at the end of the presentation, actually sent us a stage the importance of keeping the human rights framework in perspective. Because in India, we do notice now ideas of indigenization or decolonization actually is being used by right-wing conservative fundamentalist forces to completely redo curriculum in universities, restrain women's rights to make their life choices like whom they want to marry, come in the way of interreligious marriages, intercaste marriages. So is there really a pre-colonial past that is really so harmonious and equal is actually the question. And in many parts of our world, they were not really equal. So decolonization should not throw us back to a period which is again not so good for women and girls or gender non-conforming individuals. So it's a tightrope walking, and I think it's important for all of us to put our heads together how we don't replace the word cultural relativism now with decolonization and land up in a new set of problems. Thank you.
I'll let you respond to that one, Angela, before we take the next
Absolutely,
question.
Dr. Lakshmi, I agree. I agree, and I did say that, we must not, it's not a black and white either or equation. Decolonization in itself can cause further harm, and you point out the very good examples of, marriage practices in pre-colonial India. What we need to think about is, just have progress, like I said, propel us forward with human rights in mind. And the anti-rights movements have been very, very smart at using the language of the pro-rights caucus. So language like decolonization, we came up with that language, and then they've turned it around and said, oh yes, we must decolonize and return to, misogynistic practices. What we need to do is, I think, stay ahead of the conversation and use the language in a way that it speaks to propelling society forward and striking down all the misogyny that came with a lot of pre-colonial practices. In Africa, it is, I think, a little less complicated than in other parts of the world, but you do raise a very, very big quandary that we face about the language and how it is applied by the different wings, right wing and the left wing. Thank you.
We had a question there, and then got you.
Thank you so very much. Ilana Larry from the University of Pretoria. I think mine is somewhat of a interjection to perhaps situate the South African or to remind us of the ideological intention behind the decriminalization of abortion in South Africa. In 1986 already, the National Party government established a President's Council precisely to address the population demographic issue. And the problem for this council was precisely the increased black population, right? The African population and the matter of the black peril, as they put it, the swart gevaar. And for them already in 1986, it was established that there is a massive need to decriminalize abortion, precisely because of the reason being then for them that if it is made accessible, if abortions are made accessible, it will normalize the tendency that pregnancies can be unwanted. And because of that logic of if it is normalized, the logic would be that pregnancy is unwanted, and therefore, particularly those parties within the urban communities will have access to abortion, and because it's normalized, they will make use of abortion in the urban setting. At the same time, the logic is that in the rural setting where people don't have access to abortion, because of unsafe abortions, the black population will nonetheless be inhibited because people will die. Now, this is the logic that then informed the negotiations and then being the 1994 transition to democracy in South Africa. The negotiations, this having then an impact, or one of the negotiations then being that, okay, because of the black peril, we need to legalize abortion for the urban setting, and at the same time, we will not provide the facilities to then make it accessible in the rural settings. So I think perhaps when we think about how to then correct abortion and what the impact is, we need to go back to the ideological intention that underpins a white supremacist state that is now puppeteered by black faces and black politicians in South Africa. So I think perhaps going back to its ideological roots can be useful for when we address how to then set up facilities that is precisely life-saving for people, and how to correct policy issues to go back to its ideological roots. Yeah, I guess that's my intervention in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you've pointed out a piece of a backstory that is not known to many. The ideological roots were, very colonial themselves. But I think this is an example of, a bad intention that becomes good, because the data is very clear that deaths from unsafe abortion are much lower in South Africa than in other places where abortion is criminalized. In fact, the South African story is used very much as an example of why we must decriminalize abortion. And we must be grateful for technological advances that frustrated the white supremacist objectives in decriminalizing abortion in South Africa. So that's just another milestone. Thanks for raising that.
Okay, we have a question down the front here with Lenore, and then we're going 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3.
I'm worried that I'm going to drag us away a little bit. Sorry, I'm Lenore Manderson. Hello, Angela. Thank you so much. Your focus on, or the discussion now focused on abortion, although you raised other issues around reproductive choice, and I want to come back to that in a moment. And I'm speaking really as someone who works in South Africa, but also I've worked with and supervised doctoral students in both Uganda and Kenya, where abortion is not legal, and where women routinely resort to unsafe abortion and die, so that the maternal mortality rates directly reflect legal status. And so your comments just now about South Africa and the law is really relevant, and I think one must keep that in mind. However, I was struck also in thinking through what stigma does in South Africa as elsewhere, not only in terms of sort of for the women seeking it, but the punitive nature of healthcare staff who often withhold the provision of abortion or a referral because it contradicts their own values. And those values, of course, are not only around the right of a person to have an abortion, but also the right of the person to access contraception or to access sexual and reproductive health. And in that context, this country, for example, there was a lot of controversy some years ago, meaning pre-COVID, around human papillomavirus injections for adolescent girls, because that would encourage them all to be sexually active. And I do think that there is always that tension between what is a right and what are values, and often people arguing against those rights draw on what they represent as traditional values in order to strip women of rights.
Excellent observation, Lenore. And we see this playing out not only in South Africa, in places like Rwanda, where abortion is permitted in more broader circumstances than Uganda and Kenya. Access is limited by what we have, sanctioned, conscientious objection. We tell providers that if you feel because of your personal values, you cannot provide a service, you don't have to. But conscientious objection does not mean you cannot make a referral. And this is where I think we might be shooting ourselves a bit in the foot. And there's a whole body of work on redefining what is conscientious objection. And is conscientious objection, does it stand in the way of human rights? I think that's a whole other discussion. So stigma at the provider level, I think, should be also included as a form of reproductive coercion, because the end goal, the end result is that the client does not get the reproductive service that they choose. So it goes back to the question of how do we dismantle stigma? It's not enough to dismantle stigma at the individual and the community level. We must tackle stigma at the facility level. I'll tell you that in Rwanda, when IPAS was entering Rwanda, there was a big push to conduct training for providers on how to provide a safe abortion service. And training was widely done, widely attended, and we could easily see increases in knowledge and practice between, pre and post tests. But nothing happened on the service delivery front because precisely of stigma. So we had to take 10 steps backwards and start with clarifying the values of the midwives, of the in-charges, of the district leaders, the cleaners, and the people who opened the facilities before we retrained and began to see a needle moving in terms of service delivery. So institutional stigma is a huge hindrance, as you so rightly point out, Lenore.
Thank you. We have a question up the back there first. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm Bahar, I'm from the Netherlands, and I work at the Department of Midwifery Science in Amsterdam. And my question was, what really caught my attention was your statement that decolonization has the capacity to cause harm. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer your question, I'll go back to the first comment that was made by Dr. Lakshmi. In which she said that the whole decolonization exercise is promoting previous cultures that were very misogynistic. The marriage practices around, caste and so on and so forth. That is a harm, but it is being done under the ambit of decolonization. Another example, if we think about, the two examples I mentioned, contraception and sexual and reproductive health services. If we say colonization made these services impossible to achieve, and then we say let's decolonize, we end up going back to a place where we have no reproductive health services that are safe. We dismantle a lot of good that was done by training and organizing health services to improve sexual and reproductive health. So in decolonization, I guess we have to be a little bit selfish. We pick what has worked for us and reject that which came, to label women as either reproductive beings and became very negative for the reproductive rights themselves. The services are good. The services in many places came with colonialism, and they are good, they are right and just. But the whole narrative around this is good and this is bad, this is biblical, this is related to religion and so on, I think that is something we need to interrogate a little bit more and decolonize. So that is my brief answer to your question. I hope I answered you.
Okay, we have another question up the back. Sorry, Angela, we're putting you to great work here. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Tozel. I am a third-year PhD student at Brandeis in the United States. I'm actually coming to Nairobi at the end of this week, and I hope to meet you some way, shape, or form. My research is on the role and the impact of professionalizing midwifery on maternal health outcomes. And I was wondering if you can speak towards how professionalization of midwifery, how the banning of traditional birth attendants involvement in birth, how does that fit in the theory or framework of decolonization?
Well, that's a question that needs a lot of thinking about. Banning the traditional birth attendants. I think we also have to recognize that traditional birth attendants cannot be banned and unbanned. They are there. They live among us. They are historical, they are cultural, and there will always be a form of a traditional birth attendant. Whether it is the doula or it's the woman sitting in my home village with her tools and herbs, there will always be a form of traditional birth attendant. The central question is, how much harm does the traditional birth attendant cause? And the theory behind banning traditional birth attendants was a realization that there was a lot of harm that was being caused by traditional birth attendants. In the setting that I'm most familiar with in Uganda, the decision was made not to ban them because you cannot ban them, but to roll them within the cadre of, of village health workers. Village health workers that are recognized, and their role is to do a referral. It begets the question of, can traditional birth attendants be professionalized? And I think the short answer might be that not immediately. There has to be a curve, a pathway towards that. But on the other hand, midwives themselves have been permitted to perform wider functions within the health services. In certain places, midwives now perform cesarean sections, and I think this is where we need to go. This is a broad area of work, task sharing, that is relevant to this discussion. But you have a very strong argument that needs a wider discussion.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It made me think about a lot of things, which is a good start for the day. My name is Nana Abul Saud. I'm from Egypt. And I'd like for us to, I'm inviting all of us when we're talking about decolonization, is also to not just get fixated on a certain period of time and forget about the current colonizing projects. So looking at Africa, for example, the presence of emirates in many of our lands, modern slavery, financial arrangements like the kafala system in the Persian Gulf is another thing to keep in mind. So I'd like for us, when we are considering decolonization as a model, especially when it comes to bodily autonomy and reproductive justice and reproductive rights, is to think in more complex contemporary terms, not to discard what the French and the British did back in the day, because that can be grounded in reparation efforts, right? We can get together, mobilize around that and be very clear, but there is still modern colonization that is not getting enough attention from us as feminists, from us as social justice activists. We should look at trade agreements. We should look at how the Mediterranean is being guarded by North African states through migration pacts with the European Union and drowning our people in the sea. So I think I'm trying to push us, when we're talking about decolonization, to not just think of it as in gray, yellow pages terms. Is also not to discard it. We should really get the reparation that we need from those times, but we should also be vigilant about what's happening in our today's world.
Mm-hmm. Very excellent point, Nana. And I might have said that the discussion is a little bit simplistic. You can only provide so much in 15 minutes. But of course, colonialism is not just French and Eurocentric. There was also colonization by the Arabs, by the way, the Arab occupation of Africa and some parts of Africa that had Indian colonization. But the point is that the Berlin Conference is the one that provided the hugest, if you are to construct a natural experiment. I think the Berlin Conference would be that event that marked colonial influences. Now, current day colonialism is playing out. And one of the other instances that you could have mentioned is, we see a lot of our health workforce migrating. That is colonialism, it's nothing else. And some of the beneficiary countries are obviously, they're not even putting money in the countries from which this health workforce is coming. But this is another form of colonialism. We also see domestic workers moving every day, and they suffer huge reproductive rights injustices. These must also play into the discussion in the future. But we're kind of now dealing with what is clear, what is known, and what is comfortable. We must also move to these areas that are a little bit grayer now. Thank you so much for raising it, Nana.
Thank you. My name is Tsitsi Maswaure from Zimbabwe, but based in the US, WPI, Massachusetts. I was wondering if you would be willing to comment on your thoughts around abortion. So looking at the US, I don't know if you watched the presidential debate a few weeks ago, and Trump said, the Democrats are saying abortion rights till birth. So you get the baby 9 months and you can abort at 9 months. And so in the US, the conversation is around abortion or termination of pregnancy at any point when a woman decides for whatever reason. But I'm wondering, what is the conversation like in Africa, for instance, in many African countries? Because in your presentation, you talked about the 3 months. Has the conversation moved beyond termination of pregnancy beyond 3 months when it's not related to the health of the mother, etc.? So I'm wondering if, I know it's a contentious topic, but what are the conversations in Africa around when those rights end and when they become unreasonable beyond 3 months or beyond the first trimester?
Titi, unfortunately, when the US catches a cold, when they sneeze, we all catch a cold. The world is laser focused on the discussions in the United States and Roe v. Wade and so on and so forth. But I think we must remember some fundamental biological facts. An abortion, as we know it, is a termination of pregnancy before a certain period of time. And I think medical science is very clear on that. And a discussion about abortion until birth, I think there has to be a debate around, is that really an abortion and what is it called? But your question is about what's the discussion on in Africa. In Africa, a lot of countries have criminalized abortion, except on certain grounds. And I mentioned the Maputo Protocol. The Maputo Protocol provides a framing through which we progress abortion conversations on the continent. It is not perfect, but it does expand the criteria under which an abortion can be legally obtained. Most of our country laws restrict abortion only to when the health of the mother is at risk. But the Maputo Protocol expands it to rape, incest, the health of the baby, and the health of the mother. So on the continent, that is the minimum that we want to see in many countries because it does expand access. We also, in another way, try to say that, okay, even if it's legal only to save the life of the mother, where do the services exist that save the life of the mother? So we expand access in these areas. But I'll also tell you that the anti-rights movement, the far right, is looking at the United States example and saying that, okay, it is possible to strike down the Maputo Protocol in Africa and further restrict life-saving care. So the discussion in Africa is actually very clean-cut. It's more clear-cut than it is in the West, in America. In America, there's a lot of fear-mongering, if you will, say that, they'll take your babies out and snatch them and murder them. I don't think that's true. I think what is being talked about is access before a certain time. And states that are moving to restrict any abortion, even before 6 weeks, before people know they are pregnant, that is where the battle line should be drawn. There should be access about until a certain time.
Hi, everyone. I loved your presentation, and thank you for that. My name is Tulani Siziba. I'm from the University of Johannesburg, based in South Africa. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of time in the very same conversation of abortion. And my reason was really, my question was based on wanting to know your understanding on whether or not you think the stigma around accessibility of abortion is perhaps perceived as the tool to perpetuate secularization of cultural beliefs, insofar as the notion of Ubuntu is concerned, right? Ubuntu being both the metaphysical and the physical world, and for instance, the ancestors. So I'll give you like a scenario. I did a study in White City, in one of the Soweto townships, looking at the experiences of paternal non-disclosure. And one of the narratives was that people are given children by their ancestors, and hence the notion that within families, there are those who are the chosen ones, and chosen ones who are people who are meant to rescue the family from all the struggles that they might face. And so the perpetuation of abortion from that particular person might therefore be perceived as the fight against the ancestors' will, you know, and which in a way in turn is perceived therefore as opening the door for ancestors to inflict harm on the very same person who has done that abortion. And that very same harm is interpreted based on the social problems that they might face in future. For instance, lack of progress, illness, and many other issues that they might face. So I'm just wondering on whether or not you think underlying the stigma around accessibility of abortion might be based on this very same understanding of, you know, cultural beliefs.
Tulani, I'm not familiar with that body of work. It sounds really, really interesting. But I would say that stigma has roots in many, many areas. A lot of stigma has roots in the Bible. A lot of stigma has roots in just personal beliefs. And then you bring up the traditional beliefs example. What I know is that in the past, pre-colonial times, abortion did exist in a lot of our societies, but it was left to a small circle of women, and society tolerated it, did not want to talk about it, but it was permitted. And if perhaps it became too much, then there would be an intervention. But it was there. It was not legalized in any way. It was not there was no law around it. But it did exist, and it was left to a circle of elders or women or, you know, traditional birth attendants, for example, to handle. So what you bring out about, you know, the post and the generational curses that come out, I think these are the very things that drive stigma. These are the very misbeliefs that do drive stigma on the continent, and they must be interrogated and questioned. And maybe as a footnote, I would say to Lani, you bring out the concept of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu in its simplest terms is they are because we have to look out for each other. And I think the fact that Ubuntu exists is one of the reasons that we must move towards a society that is very tolerant of abortion, because a woman with an unintended pregnancy is still a woman that needs help.
Thank you, Dr. Angela, for your talk. It was very thought-provoking, as you can see from the number of questions that seem to continue. I'm Rachel Simon Kumar. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I'm building on the questions that came up in the course of question time about decolonization and its limits, so to say, when applying to sexual and reproductive rights. And I was wondering, going back to the very first slide where you had a definition of reworlding, whether the comments that have been raised today merits a revisioning and revisiting the original definition in your slides.
Wow, thanks, Rachel. I'm now trying to visualize my definitions, and one of them is, you know, decolonization, the other indigenization, a world fit for our descendants. It doesn't. I don't think it does. I think the how we do it is what we need to think about. It's not enough to say, let's decolonize, strike down all colonial laws. We must take into account the beneficiaries of the decolonization experience. what do they think about the decolonization? How do they want to indigenize? What sort of world do they foresee going forward? I wouldn't strike down those four buckets that I put out there. I think the nuance I would add is, how do we proceed to achieve those definitions?
Okay, we have another question in the front here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Akol, for the presentation. My name is Benson Mulemi from Kenya, anthropologist. I've been following keenly the discussion about this decolonization and cultural diversity. And we tend to think decolonization must come from, colonization must come from outside Africa or outside the continent. What do you think about decolonization within? With regard to other aspects you mentioned, I found that abortion becomes very prominent as a politically visible subject and other subjects. And we tend to gloss over other subjects like female circumcision. You know, some people have tried to make it lighter by saying female genital cut rather than circumcision. So I was wondering what you think about this with regard to sexual reproductive health and reproduction as a biological process and social process, considering genital mutilation and other forms of genital activities in Africa. Like in Uganda, it's like opposite of genital cutting. But there's a lot of issues around there that are inbuilt for the purpose of enhancing reproductive health. Thank you.
Thank you, Benson. And I think you're right, abortion is visible because it is very colonial. I mean, contraception, abortion, like I said, apartheid, colonial. But I would say colonization within Africa, I think it's probably an oxymoron, because our understanding of colonization is that it began with the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. But then you do bring up other practices that might benefit from some sort of amendment and colonization. And this goes back to the question of what do the societies, what do the multiplicities of culture want in the decolonization agenda? Female genital cutting is demonstrably harmful. It does cause harm. Is its abolition colonization? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it's just science. On the other hand, other forms of genital manipulation cannot be subjected to, which don't cause biological harm, should perhaps be left untouched if that's what the communities want. And you're talking about female genital elongation that is practiced in many parts of Central and South Africa. That the science is clear. Populations want that to persist, so let it persist. The central question is it causing harm? If it is causing harm, what should be done about it? Whether or not it came with the Berlin Conference or whether it came from our own indigenous practices. And so female genital cutting, in my view, is something that needs to be addressed.
And I think this might be our final question. If someone's got an urgent question, put your hands up very quickly. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Lillian. I'm a postdoc fellow, University of Pretoria, affiliated also to Maseno University, Kenya. I'm just thinking, using those who give birth through the cesarean section, there is always an advice that you did not go beyond certain number of births for the sake of your health. And I'm trying to think around it in terms of abortion, assuming it is decriminalized. What would be your thoughts about capping access so that you don't endanger probably lives or things like that? Would it be open so that anytime probably you have this unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, you go for an abortion? Or would it be capped at a certain numbers allowable? What are your thoughts about capping access? Thank you.
My thoughts are that it would be an exercise in futility, because how would you enforce a cap? Knowing that once you have a safe termination of pregnancy, there are no traces on your body. How would you enforce a cap? And it would also be another form of, institutionalized patriarchy. Why do you put limits on women's bodies? So that would actually fall flat. For cesarean sections, there are sound scientific reasons why you must not have more than a certain number, and then there are scars to demonstrate that a cesarean section happened. But I don't know yet of any science that shows that above a certain threshold of pregnancy terminations, it becomes life-threatening. So I would say that is something that will be dead on arrival. Thanks, Lilian.
Okay, if there's no final questions, last chance, no? Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Akol, for a fantastic talk and wonderful question and answer session. I think we've all leave enriched with a whole range of ideas and some provocative thoughts there that no doubt will continue these conversations today and tomorrow in our conference. So we're very sorry you couldn't be here to join us, because I think everyone would agree it's a really exciting conference to have people from all across global south countries together talking about these really important issues. So please join me in thanking Dr. Akol.
Thank you too. It
And
was
just
such
a reminder
great pleasure. You
that
leave me with a lot
that
of
session
food for
will be
thought,
available on YouTube. So we've been streaming live and it will be available. So thank you. So for those of you here, and Dr. Akol, you can go and have a coffee too, but we now have coffee and tea, and just a reminder that our next session starts at 11 sharp. Thank you very much.